Welcome to the Michigan Man Podcast on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew, for Wolverine fans from coast to coast. Go Blue and welcome to the show. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Joining me today will be Detroit Free Press writer Reiner Sabin, who covers Michigan, Michigan State, and the Big Ten at large. Reiner is fairly new to the Michigan beat. He signed with the Free Press last fall after 3 years as Alabama beat writer at AL.com, and I think you'll enjoy his take on Michigan and Big Ten football. As you are well aware, the coronavirus is spiking again in virtually every state in the country. Depending on which expert or group of experts you hear from, this was either expected or as a result of trying to get back to normal too quickly. Only time will tell. We are still hopeful there will be college football, at least for the moment. Michael Spath from WTKA in Ann Arbor wrote a good piece over the weekend you might have seen in SI.com. In that story, he reported that according to sources in the Michigan Athletic Department, they are planning a season. Michael said it is almost certain we will not be traveling by air, only bus this season, which means the opener with Washington will probably not happen, although it has not officially been canceled. According to the story, we are working with a couple of MAC schools on non-conference games. We could also be playing home-and-home games with one or more Big Ten teams. It was even hinted that Notre Dame could wind up on the schedule. None of the scenarios Michael mentioned were based on official university statements. So how this shakes out remains to be seen. It seems though at this point, fans and stadiums will be a decision made by each school in cooperation with their governors, school administrations, and their medical teams. In other words, some stadiums could be empty, while others could have students, families, and in some cases, limited numbers of season ticket holders. By the time our next show airs on July 22nd, we very well could have the details on just what Michigan football has planned for the season. My guest today brings a unique perspective to covering Michigan and Big Ten football. For most of the last 3 years, he was the Alabama beat writer at AL.com. Joining us next is Reiner Sabin from the Detroit Free Press, here on this week's Michigan Man, so stay with us. Here with us on our Game Day segment this week is Reiner Sabin from the Detroit Free Press, who covers Michigan, Michigan State, and the Big Ten at large. Reiner, welcome to the show for the first time.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Reiner, I've enjoyed your work since you joined the Free Press team. And for the 3 years prior to accepting the job at the Free Press, you covered Alabama for AL.com. What made you leave SEC country to head to the frigid north?
Well, it was an interesting opportunity. The Free Press is a well-regarded paper, and obviously Michigan's a national brand and big program itself, and so I was curious to take on the challenge. I also have connections to Michigan. My father went to school there, and one of my relatives played there way back in the day. He was the quarterback for the team back in the mid-20s or in the early 20s, and when Michigan was obviously winning a lot of games back then. So there is some kind of natural connection there too.
Well, you started the last season covering Alabama, but spent most of the year covering the Big Ten and Michigan. I always like to ask folks this who have seen it from both perspectives, but from a talent angle, how big to you is that gap between those two conferences? I
think it's pretty actually significant. I haven't seen it up close, especially at the top few teams in the SEC, I think, are probably more talented across the board than many of the top few teams in the Big Ten, with the exception of Ohio State. I think Ohio State's got a comparable level of talent that you see with those top teams in the SEC, like Georgia, Alabama, and such. I do think that there's a significant drop-off after Ohio State with talent across the board, including, Michigan, Penn State, Wisconsin, which are kind of in that next tier of teams in the Big Ten as it stands right now.
Did you find a big difference when you got here between, the game day experience for fans in the Big Ten, and I mean all around the Big Ten, as compared to SEC games?
There was a noticeable difference. Some of the experiences that I had in the SEC, the fans are a little bit more rowdy, especially at LSU. I've never been to a place quite as loud as that. I mean, obviously there's a long-standing rivalry between LSU and Alabama. They play that game. The fans are raring to go for that game itself, and so it created a great environment. Bryant-Denny, where Alabama plays, is also, it can be pretty loud at night as well, although it's not as great of an atmosphere as LSU from my experience. Around the conference, Tennessee, when they had things going and the football program was really good, had been there way back when, and that atmosphere was also incredibly loud and kind of exciting itself. And then different places I've covered in the NFL, which again doesn't have nearly the kind of crowd involvement as college football. I mean, Seattle and Kansas City also have loud stadiums too. In the Big Ten, the Penn State whiteout thing was kind of neat last year to see up close firsthand. And, that was a good atmosphere too. But Michigan games, again, generally because of the way the stadium is structured, I don't think holds in the crowd noise as much. And so it's a little bit more of a quiet environment than you would typically see at some of these bigger programs.
Well, Reiner, before you joined the Free Press, and I know you mentioned that you have connections to the University of Michigan with your dad having gone there and a relative playing back in the 20s. Mm-hmm. If someone would have asked you for your thoughts on Michigan football, what would you have said?
I grew up watching the program, and, I think it's a nationally relevant program. I always thought, especially when I was growing up, and, in the 90s, they were in the mix for a national championship. And, I think that's what the expectation is when you think of Michigan, is that program with that kind of resources and that kind of tradition is going to be in contention for a national championship more often than not. And so I think in the last 10 years or so, I guess I've been somewhat surprised by, obviously the struggles that they've had when they had Rick Rodriguez and Brady Hoke. And, I think Jim Harbaugh has elevated the program back to kind of a level where they're extremely competitive, but they're still on the outside looking in. And so my impressions of Michigan have probably changed a little bit. Kind of the expectations, I think, are still there, but the overall impression has changed a little bit just given the recent struggles in the last decade or so.
Well, I know, and I'm sure you've picked up on this in less than a year, and having watched Michigan football for a lot of your life, that the Michigan fan base wants to join the ranks of the elite again. Bringing Jim Harbaugh back was supposed to move us closer in that direction. And I know some writers, football historians, say we've never really been elite. I hear that a lot. Do you think the program, though, is a little bit closer now, or are expectations still not grounded in reality?
I think they're closer than they were, say, under Rich Rodriguez and Brady Hoke. Are they closer than they were under Lloyd Carr? I would say no. I mean, and I think that maybe the expectations are high, but I don't think they're unjustified given the stature of the program itself. Again, its tradition of producing great players at various different positions, and also the fact that, again, they at one point were competing for the Big Ten title every year in and year out. And so I think those expectations are justified now. I think the field has gotten a lot more competitive, especially as the SEC has gotten more exposure through TV. I mean, Michigan used to have a huge advantage because they were on national TV all the time. I grew up watching them. You turn on ABC, they'd have a game on. If you look at like Tennessee around the mid-90s, they didn't always get on national TV. They were on regional TV, sometimes on pay-per-view. And Michigan had very few games on a pay-per-view type situation. I mean, you could generally turn on the TV. It's going to be on ESPN or ABC back in the day. And so I think some of that advantage has been mitigated as the TV footprint has expanded, and now SEC games are on TV at all times. So a lot of these kids are not likely to leave that area of the country if they are being recruited by schools beyond the region in the South. And it just happens to be that a lot of the talent happens to be in the South too. So I think that's a thing that Michigan, again, took advantage of at one point, their national brand. And I just don't know if the national brand has much of an advantage as it once did. I think, it still exists, but I think other schools can make a claim that they have as much visibility as Michigan.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, you started the season last year covering Alabama, then Michigan a good part of the season, and Michigan State in the Big Ten. But when Michigan and Alabama hooked up in the bowl game, which is the last time we've seen Michigan play, did it play out pretty much the way you thought it would?
I was actually kind of surprised that Michigan really kind of was able to move the ball as effectively at times against their defense as they were, especially in the first half. In the second half, I think, again, Alabama's overall depth and probably talent advantage at certain positions ended up proving to be the difference during that second half. But, yeah, I mean, it essentially played out. I mean, I think, again, the difference could have been more substantial if, Tua Tagovailoa was the quarterback for Alabama than Mac Jones. And who knows? I mean, Alabama may not have been in the game itself. If Tua Tagovailoa was healthy, they may have been back in the college football playoff. And so the game itself, I think, played out generally how I would have expected. I mean, again, talent usually wins in those games. And the fact is that Alabama is just a little bit cut above it right now that Michigan is as far as talent is concerned.
Well, talent, and what was obvious in that game was the difference in speed. They were just Jerry Jeudy, in particular, Jerry Jeudy, the guy is just, wow. I mean, he's unlike, I don't think there have been many, even in Alabama, with that kind of speed.
Ruggs actually was even faster. The thing that Jeudy is so good at, and talking to NFL people, is that he's the best route runner that they've seen come out of there in a long time, and he really sets up guys really well with his footwork and technique. And one of the guys who actually coached him was Josh Gaddis, so I think he did take some tips from Josh Gaddis, and I think one of the things that Michigan may have missed out on last year was the fact that Gaddis really wasn't overseeing the wide receivers. Obviously his duty was mostly arranging the offense itself, and so he couldn't devote his time to that. But again, I think from everything I've heard and talked to people within the Alabama program was that Gaddis was, a very much a technician as far as a receivers coach goes. He made a difference with a lot of those guys, and certainly helped a guy like Jerry Jeudy.
Well, I talked to an NFL scout last year before that bowl game with Alabama, and he said in his opinion there wasn't a player on Michigan starting offense or defense that could start at Bama, which is really scary, especially given how many Michigan players were drafted. But would you say that's a pretty accurate statement?
I did talk to a person, hell of a guy in the NFL who said the exact same thing, actually. And I guess, I'd have to go on them. They have more expertise than I do. I think Ruiz would have probably had a shot to start at Alabama for sure. I think that Nico Collins could have been in the rotation at receiver. I don't know, if he would have been a starter, but he's certainly an intriguing prospect. And so I think that there are players at Michigan that would have been contending for starting jobs, if not outright starting. There just wouldn't have been a lot of them. Alabama, again, they recruit at an extremely high level. That's their focus. Sabin has long invested time and effort into recruiting and reviewing tape and creating a very regimented system for how they do evaluate the players on the roster. And they usually get coaches that appeal to recruits, and so it's a pretty sophisticated operation they run there, and I think that's part of the reason they have been able to separate themselves for a while, and at least in the last decade, creating the kind of blueprint for the rest of college football to follow to make themselves a perennial contender.
Here with us on our Game Day segment this week is Reiner Sabin from the Detroit Free Press, who covers Michigan, Michigan State, and the Big Ten at large. Reiner, after a year of covering Jim Harbaugh, your opinion of him?
I think he's a good coach. Do I think he's performed up to the level of his salary? No, I don't. I think he's, fallen short of that and fallen short of, I guess, expectations of what maybe he's supposed to bring. I would have hoped that the quarterback development would be better under Harbaugh, and I'm really surprised by that. And I think that's what, in part, holding back the program is the fact that the quarterback position hasn't developed. One of the key selling points was his offense that he brought with him from San Francisco, but in some ways, I don't know if that naturally translates to college football, and he's had to adjust. So the one thing that he kind of really hung his hat on doesn't really apply anymore.
Well, as we mentioned, you cover Michigan State too, and over in East Lansing, It was a mess last year. It got crazier after the season when Mark D'Antonio retired. What's your take on the state of Spartan football right now, Reiner?
I think they're very much in a transition phase, and I think they've really were hurt by the timing of D'Antonio's retirement and the hiring of Mel Tucker. I mean, he was hired in February 12th, have a ripple effect for years to come.
Well, the Big Ten right now, as we all know, and we've known for the better part of a decade, it's Ohio State, and then it's everyone else, and they are playing at and recruiting on a level that is just unbelievable. I mean, I've been around for a long time. They've always recruited well, pretty much always recruited well in Ohio, and they could get away with it until the 80s and the 90s when they became more national. But they still are such a cut apart from everyone else, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, from a recruiting perspective and seeing what they've already done this year, it's impressive. I mean, I think they definitely have a system that they used that's very effective. I got some preliminary NFL grades from a source in the NFL, and I mean, the number of potential first-round picks that are on the roster and that could be drafted in next year's draft is pretty extensive, and it just is a continuation of what they have already done, and the recruiting just seems like it's just going to again build on that they're doing now. And so again, it's just a kind of a vicious cycle if you're a Michigan fan, just to see what they've been able to do. They again, they recruit really well. That gets the players that they need to win, and then also get to the NFL, and that gets more players because they want to go to the NFL too. And so it's a self-perpetuating situation for them, and it's a very hard thing for Michigan to overcome right now.
Well, as much as we all want there to be a college football season now, and we need a diversion, we were all excited when teams reported for their voluntary workouts a couple of weeks ago, but the entire situation is still so very precarious, isn't it?
Yes, it's very precarious. I mean, there's so many things you have to factor in. The Big Ten has a pretty wide footprint with a school in New Jersey, a school in Nebraska, all the schools in between. I mean, you have different state orders that are going to potentially come into play. The coronavirus could spike in different states at different times. The logistics of, traveling. I mean, there's north of 100 people that usually go on these trips, the hotel situation, also, again, state regulations and restrictions, especially if they have a quarantine order. How's that going to work? I mean, there's so many different things you have to factor in, and it's, I was talking to a Michigan staffer, and, he's very skeptical about the season going forward, even though he'd like to see it obviously come to fruition, but it's a very precarious situation right now.
Oh, yeah, and I saw a piece in SI.com on Sunday, I think it was, Michael Spath, who is also at WTKA in Ann Arbor. He laid out a lot of scenarios, a full season, traveling by bus only, playing home-and-home games with conference rivals. He mentioned maybe Michigan and Michigan State playing each other twice. Not all teams participating is something that is real. Playing only conference games, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
We have to be close to a plan being set forth in the next couple of weeks, or maybe not. I don't know. I guess given the spike in numbers, there might not be any kind of resolution for a while, Reiner.
Yeah, it's a really touch and go situation, and it's really unfortunate that this is what's happening, but it is really fluid right now. And again, the scenarios could materialize to, by bringing it in conference, you're at least creating a chance for more uniformity as far as testing is concerned and controlling maybe the environment. Like maybe you have specific team hotels that are designated, for teams when they do have to travel. And that way you can regulate things a little bit better than you would if you invited other programs from other conferences, especially the lower ones where they might not have as much funding at the university level to be able to do adequate testing. And so I think that that's something that has to be on the table, is possibly just limiting it to in conference. I think you can have more control over that. But again, it's such a fluid situation right now, and I don't know if there's going to be a across the board resolution anytime soon.
No, and I think I've sort of come to the conclusion, although there's been nothing official, that whatever happens in the coming weeks, I would find it really unlikely we're going to see fans in the stadiums. Or do you think that is still a possibility somewhere in the country?
I could see maybe it being a possibility. I mean, you'd have to have a very limited number. It'd be interesting to see how they would handle that, especially with the donor situation as far as, who gets in and who doesn't. It's, there's so many complex things with having even fans in there just because of, liability, potential, and also just knowing what the state, regulations are at the time. I mean, as far as limiting crowd size and such. I mean, obviously, here in Michigan, they've had orders limiting, gatherings at different numbers over the course of this pandemic. And so I think any of that could come into play and totally force them to readjust whether they allow fans in. I mean, I can see, again, a scenario where they do, but whether that will actually happen is hard to tell.
Yeah, I think in the last week we've had a new wrench thrown into this that not a lot of people are thinking about yet, but we have 14 states that have applied travel quarantines. If you come into that state, you have to stay for 14 days, and many more are expected to roll into that in the coming weeks. And if that gets extended into football season, you've got big problems because teams cannot leave their state.
Yes, it would be impossible to do anything like that, especially, you couldn't go into another state to be able to play a game because then you'd have to quarantine, and then it's a really complicated situation. As much as I'd like to see the college football season be played, I don't know if it can be done in a safe and effective way. They might be better to punt to the spring. Of course, I don't know how, the athletic directors are going to handle this and how the NCAA is going to handle this. It's probably the most monumental challenge they'll face and they'll ever face. The situation itself, it's just got so many different tentacles and different aspects that you have to really think through, and it's almost overwhelming.
Well, it certainly is overwhelming. You're right about that. A final question for you, Reiner, and then we'll let you get on your way here. Almost a year under your belt covering Michigan State and the Big Ten. Overall, was the experience pretty much what you expected it would be?
Yeah, I did. I think it's again very interesting. Both programs are interesting themselves. Michigan State, Rob, as big as it is, I think that dominates the comment section on our articles more so than Michigan, Ohio State. I don't know if that's just because, again, all our readers are mostly from Michigan, and so I think that was the thing that was most eye-opening to me was how strong the rivalry between Michigan and Michigan State is as compared to even Michigan, Ohio State.
And hopefully there's going to be a season so that we can get you back on and talk Michigan and Big Ten football. So I thank you for your time, and you take care of yourself, and we look forward to that next visit.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to Reiner Sabin from the Detroit Free Press for joining us today. He'll be back once the season gets underway. A reminder, we are on our summer schedule until August, when we start previewing the upcoming season. Our next show airs on July 22nd, so mark that on your calendar. Our scheduled guest is recruiting guru Steve Lorenz from 24/7 Sports, with, of course, a recruiting update. The class of 2021 is ranked in the top 5 right now, but if we get verbals from just a couple of our in-state kids, it will go even higher. So we shall see. A reminder to like or comment on the show wherever you get your podcasts from. It really does help us. That will do it for another show. I know this has been a strange summer so far, really a strange year, but we are all doing our best to get through this pandemic, and hopefully college football will return and raise our spirits. Heaven knows we need something to take our attention off all of the bad news surrounding us. So take care of yourselves and join me on July 22nd on our next show with Steve Lorenz from 24/7 Sports. I'm your host, Mike Fitzpatrick. Have a great Wolverine week, everyone. Until next time, take care, and as always, go blue. Thanks for joining us today on The Michigan Man, here on Wolverine Sports Radio, a member of the V Sporto Network, and in partnership with SB Nation's Maize and Brew. Our listener lines are open 24/7 for your calls at 313-263-4842. That's 313-263-4842. Or email us at themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. That's themichiganmanpodcast@yahoo.com. The Michigan Man Podcast is produced at the studios of Robin Lynn Productions, Allen Park, Michigan, and is not affiliated with the University of Michigan. Go Blue!